The very fact that we have a plethora of wealth preachers in our day gives me to wonder whether the almost total absence of preaching about sin and the cross, hell, and salvation can be explained by the fact that such preachers are in reality lovers and servants of material wealth. So much then for the preoccupation with the accumulation of material wealth. We turn now to the second issue of managing wealth, and that is the presumption concerning wealth. The presumption concerning wealth. And here we will need to go to James chapter 4 from verse 13. Firstly, I want to highlight the worldly assumption. This is an individual, a Christian or a non-Christian, who shows extraordinary arrogance by assuming a great deal when it comes to accumulating wealth. James says, "Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money." We can see it clearly. Today or tomorrow, we will go to this or that city. We will spend a year there. We will carry on business. We will make money. Whether the person is a Christian or not, the assumption is total. At no point does the individual fit a proviso in there. He simply assumes that because this is his aspiration and plan, then he will go ahead with that which he has schemed about. Now, James's audience would have clearly understood what he was talking about here, because at this time there were groups of Jews who moved around the place as itinerant merchants, and from the outside it would have looked just like this concerning such people. They just packed up and went wherever they assumed they would trade profitably. Now, I haven't come across Christians who have actually done this, but I've come across a Christian who appeared not to have referenced God in his plans at all. I can distinctly remember on occasion in Botswana when a bloke made an appointment with me to ask for prayer. He was a South African and he was obviously anticipating getting a job in Botswana. Now, in Botswana, you had to have a skill which no Motswana had before you could get a work permit. He asked me to pray for him that he would get a good job, thereby enabling him to get a work permit. He also asked me to pray that it would be a good salaried job. And then he said that the reason that he wanted prayer was so that he could tithe and give generously to the church. Now, here was a bloke who was assuming that he would get a job, and just to ensure that he got such a job, he assumed that God would be delighted to have somebody who would give generously to his work. James is warning Christians here not to be presumptuous about accumulating wealth on their own terms. Thus, and secondly, he pointed out that they needed an alteration to their thinking, an alteration to their assumptive approach. They needed to do three things. Number one, they needed to realize that they had no control over their lifespans. In verse 14, he says, "Why? You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes." There are just so many scriptural verses which make the point that our lives are fragile and fleeting. In Psalm 144, verse 4, it says, "Man is like a breath. His days are like a passing shadow." In Proverbs 27:1, "Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day might bring." And the God-revealed approach to all of this is captured in Psalm 90, verse 12, where we are told to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. A Christian is meant to live in the light of the value of today. Number two, they needed to embrace God's expected attitude. In verse 15, James says, "Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or do that." Like every aspect of our Christian lives, we must increasingly realize that every aspect of our lives needs to be lived under the lordship of Jesus. That couldn't be more obviously stated than in 1 Corinthians 6:20. You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your body. Every decision which we make as Christians has to be informed by the will of God. And this is particularly the case when it comes to finding a job and making a living. And I wonder how many Christians have ignored God's leading in this area simply because we have bypassed the step of discerning His will. Number three, these people needed to learn humility. In verse 16, it reads, "As it is, you boast and brag. All such boasting is evil. Anyone then who knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it, sins." I am struck by the fact that James calls this presumptuous approach as involving boasting and bragging. Why? Because many wealthy people are incredibly arrogant. Worse, they treat people of lesser wealth as if they were of lesser worth. Now, I love watching people, particularly as they interact with others. And so I am in a coffee shop and I watch a clearly well-off lady shown to her seat. And often I do not hear the words please or thank you. And often, if I'm close enough, I can see that the bill costs 400 rand, and the woman then goes scratching in her purse and takes out 1.45 rand as a tip. Very interesting that such arrogance in the context of employing money is considered a sin by God. The lesson we need to learn, especially if we are worldly wealthy and assume a great deal, is that we need to be generous in these sorts of circumstances, thereby helping people financially and by recognizing their equal worth. We've looked at the preoccupation with wealth. We've also looked at the presumption concerning wealth. And we turn now to the third and final topic concerning managing wealth, which involves the perils of wealth. The perils of wealth. Again, we stay with James, this time in chapter 5. This teaching from James will have both shocked and antagonized those who first read it or heard it, and it may and should do the same to Christians in our day. Wealth, great wealth, is something of a two-edged sword. On the one hand, God blesses some Christians with great wealth on the assumption that they will use it for the good of others and for the extension of the kingdom of God. On the other hand, great wealth can corrupt Christians by the misuse of it. Firstly, there is the misuse of wealth. In verse 1 of chapter 5, James says, "Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming upon you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workmen who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. James is pleading and warning Christians of the truly catastrophic outcome of misusing wealth. In Matthew 6:19, we've already heard Jesus command people, "Do not store up for yourselves treasure on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal." He says, don't hoard up worldly wealth, because in measure you will spend so much time and effort trying to protect it. That wealth could be gainfully employed by sharing it with the less fortunate and by facilitating the building of the kingdom of God. Properly employed, wealth is a tangible way of loving and providing for the less wealthy, and also for making possible that part of kingdom growth which requires financing. James now talks to people who have misused their wealth by hoarding it. You have hoarded wealth in the last days, and as a result, that wealth has been totally wasted. Already their wealth had rotted. Already moths had eaten their clothes. Already their gold and silver had been corroded. When wealth is accumulated in vast measure, as happens with Christians and non-Christians alike, by hoarding it, those people simply buy more stuff. They buy more houses, businesses, cars, shares, thereby ensuring that it has not been employed as God intended it to be. And there are dreadful consequences for the hoarder. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. According to Tasker, the treasury of accumulated wealth becomes in effect a treasury of divine wrath, from which God will draw on the day of judgment. His reasoning is that this hoarded wealth, already ruined, indicates that the individuals who have been hoarding it, they themselves have already been pulled away from God, and so will suffer God's punishment for this sin. A bloke called Ropes says, the idea is of rust corroding and so consuming human flesh, like the wearing out of the flesh of a rusty iron chain, a terrible image for the disastrous results of treating money as the chief reliance and aim of life. That is the sure outcome of the misuse of wealth. Secondly, there is the mishandling of wealth, and there are two ways by which this is done. Number one, wealth is mishandled when it is withheld fraudulently. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workmen who mowed your fields are crying out against you. John Calvin concludes, what can be more base than that they who supply us with bread by their labor should be pined through want? And yet this monstrous thing is common, for there are many of such tyrannical disposition that they think that the rest of mankind live only for their benefit. Number two, wealth is mishandled when it becomes luxury and self-indulgence. Verse 5, you've lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves for the day of slaughter. We haven't got time to look at this properly, but I need to say that for me, money and wealth are perhaps the most profound challenges which face us as we seek to live a Christian life. How much we accumulate and how much we distribute are the issues.